Welcome to the first of our series of lectures. In today's lecture, we will be considering research strategies and designs. In this lecture, we will outline a structured 9-step model for conducting rigorous research. The 9-step model emphasizes that the selection of a research strategy is the core decision in any study design. The process begins with defining the research population and formulating precise research questions, then determining whether an observational or experimental approach is suitable. Subsequent steps involve selecting an appropriate research design, guided by the principle of parsimony, identifying and measuring variables, and choosing a sampling procedure to ensure validity. The final steps of the 9-step model cover implementing the research plan, analyzing the data that has been collected, with a focus on fairly testing the questions, and then going on to disseminate the findings to contribute to the scientific base. It is important to acknowledge that research is an iterative process where answers often lead to new questions. The selection of a research strategy is the core of a research design, and this is probably the single most important decision the investigator has to make. The success or failure of a study, of a research protocol, is dependent on the chosen research strategy. And so this is a very critical first step which the researcher has to ensure that he or she gets right. Successful research can be characterized by a series of well-defined steps. Research questions can be quite demanding, and sometimes, in order to answer those research questions, we would have to carry out complex and intense investigation efforts. For example, a researcher may start by asking the question, why do people consume large amounts of saturated fats, despite widespread awareness that these fats cause heart disease? This question could lead the investigator to pursue a number of reasons. The investigator could decide to focus on cognitive reasons, and so people may provide responses such as, those foods really taste good, or those foods are satisfying. People could also consume large amounts of saturated fats because of social reasons. There could be cultural reasons. People could take diets which are traditional, even though they may not be as healthy as they should be. It could also be for economic reasons. Fatty foods may be more filling and less expensive than healthy food alternatives. The investigator could also decide to focus on perceived vulnerability of study participants to diseases that are associated with a diet that is high in saturated fats. Thus, we see that the seemingly humble research question that we started with could encompass an entire research career. Successful researchers devote themselves to one or two areas of inquiry, and this focus is what enables them to use findings from one study as the platform to formulate subsequent research questions for the next study, and so on. And so this emphasizes that developing focus is one of the characteristics of successful researchers. We go on to the 9-step model. The first step is to define the research population. Who are we going to study? Who are the people that we are interested in studying? And the second step is to define the research goal and to specify the exact research questions that we are interested in answering. Step 3 involves determining whether the research should be observational or experimental. The fourth step leads us to select a research design that provides a rigorous test of the research question. Having selected the research design, we then go on to determine the variables that must be measured. And in step 6, we select the sampling procedure. Step 7 is to implement the research plan, while step 8 is to analyze the data. Step 9 involves disseminating the findings. All too often, we find that we focus attention quite a lot of the time on step 7 and 8 and often do not pay as much attention as we ought to on step 1 through to step 7. It is very important to understand that in this 9-step model, we move sequentially from step 1 all the way to step 9 in order to have a successful research output. We shall look now in more detail at each of these steps. When we use the term population, it is a broad term which can be defined in many different ways. The researcher therefore needs to specify the parameters that will describe the target population. Defining the target population is not an arbitrary process. Selecting the population should be based on known epidemiology of the disease or health risk behavior that we are considering. For example, a population may be defined as low-income youths aged 13 to 19 years of age who reside in rural tobacco-producing states. After defining the study population or the research population, we need to define the research goal and we need to specify the exact research questions. Narrow, precisely defined goals and questions are more amenable to rigorous research designs than broadly defined goals and questions. So what this tells us is that we need to develop a narrow focus and to have exactly specified research questions. So we need to thoroughly review the recent and relevant literature to avoid the pitfall of broad goals and broad questions. Typically, when we carry out relevant literature review, it is usually restricted to the past 5 years. It should include articles that are directly related to the topic and those related tangentially to the topic. But we should assign a higher priority to directly related articles. Still, in step 2, the research goal is a general statement that conveys the purpose of the planned study. And the goal provides an overview of purpose and scope, but it lacks precision and specificity. So an example of a research goal may be to determine the efficacy of providing behavioral interventions for youths who have recently begun to use tobacco. The research question provides the precision and specificity, unlike the research goal, which does not provide that. Research questions are based on the research goal. Each question is a derivative of the overarching research goal and should provide information that serves the research goal. Examples of research questions are as follows. Will a 12-hour small group intervention promote tobacco cessation among a greater percentage of youths than a brief version of the same program? Will a 12-hour small group intervention promote tobacco cessation among a greater percentage of youths as compared to youths who receive no program at all. And so these two examples illustrate the precision and specificity of research questions. The third step is to determine whether the research should be observational or experimental. In observational research, variables are observed as they exist in nature. There is no manipulation of the variables, and it does not involve treatment or intervention. In observational research, we ask questions that pertain to why people do what they do. By contrast, experimental research involves manipulation of a variable. It builds upon observational research by asking, how can we help people achieve positive change? Or questions such as this. Experimental research is concerned with the question of whether a given intervention can produce outcomes of statistical significance, and more importantly, whether this given intervention can produce practical or clinical significance. We now need to select a research design that provides a rigorous test of the research questions. The choice of research design may range from simple observational studies to complex experimental studies. Parsimony is a principle that implies that the need, that is, investigating the research question, is met by a tool, the research design, that does the job well, without going beyond that which is necessary. Parsimony is the guiding principle in selecting a research design. Thus, we are to select a research design that answers the research question without going beyond what is necessary. What kind of research designs can we select? We have observational research, wherein we can do qualitative research. We can carry out cross-sectional surveys, cohort studies. We could do pre-experimental studies. In this case, there are no randomly assigned controls. But we could also do true experimental studies, wherein we have randomly assigned controls. In quasi-experimental studies, a group is purposely selected for comparison. The fifth step is to determine the variables that we need to measure or that must be measured. The definition of a variable is anything that changes, meaning it must assume a range of values. Every variable required for a rigorous study must be identified. The way in which the variables are measured is important. Research rigor is dependent on the selection of reliable and valid measurement instruments. Some variables may be measured directly using physical instruments or by observation. Other variables may be measured indirectly using participants' self-reports. The sixth step is to select the sampling procedure. And there are numerous sampling procedures that can be used. The sampling procedure is one of the most critical determinants of what we call external validity. And what is external validity? It is the ability to generalize study findings to the population of individuals with similar characteristics represented in the study sample. Not all research studies need to use a sampling procedure that yields high external validity. Sampling includes specifying the number of participants, and this number, which we call the sample size, is selected based on a power analysis. A power analysis is the estimated ability of a statistical test to find true differences between variables or between groups of study participants. Sampling is one of the most important determinants of the study's power. The seventh step is to implement the research plan. Internal validity requires that all study protocols must be implemented consistently. So, if we're measuring blood pressure, for example, we need to measure it in the same way in all our study subjects. Internal validity implies that the study is not confounded by design, measurement, or poor implementation of study procedures. The eighth step, the penultimate step, is to analyze the data. Once all assessments are concluded, a data set is established. And this data set will consist of all the variables measured for each participant and is used to answer the research questions that we formulated in the second step. After the data are checked for logical inconsistencies, the research process becomes dependent on the researcher's statistical skill. Again, the principle of parsimony is also applicable here. The goal is not to perform sophisticated analysis. The goal is to perform an analysis that provides a rigorous and fair test of the research question. And the ninth step is to disseminate the study findings. Rigorous research warrants widespread dissemination. And this elevates the project from a work in progress to true science. The rudimentary starting point of this process is transforming the analytic results into carefully articulated findings. Findings are answers to the research questions that are generated by the data analysis. The findings must be considered within the context of related research. And what does that mean? In discussing our findings, we need to discuss how the findings strengthen or extend previous work. Non-significant findings, if the study has a high degree of rigor, can be just as important as significant findings with respect to building the research base. Findings may also raise additional questions that bring the research process back to its origins. Remember, we've already stated that research is an iterative process. Every time a research question is asked and answered, another question or set of questions become apparent. Once the researcher has successfully answered the research question, the remaining task is to prepare written and visual summaries of the research process. That is to say, we need to provide a narrative of steps 1 through 8. And we can present this narrative using tables and figures. This will provide a historical account of the rationale underlying the research questions and the protocols that were used to answer these questions. Written and visual records can be disseminated through multiple channels. In conclusion, in this lecture we've provided a thumbnail sketch of the research process. And this sketch can be used as a platform to gain competence and proficiency in each of the 9 steps described. The rest of this course is devoted to expanding this thumbnail sketch into a more complete masterclass of health research methods. In this particular study by Hagan et al., it is an illustration of the 9-step model. And so, as an applied example, you can download this journal article and try to identify each step of the 9-step model in this journal article. For your practice and discussion, think about your proposed research topic or study. Identify your study population, develop a single and important research question, and having resolved steps 1 and 2, begin to think about the planning phase of your study. Thus, you consider steps 4, 5, and 6. We require you to please think through each of these steps carefully and create a rigorous plan to investigate your research question.